So Jesus concludes the Beatitudes, and I think I just erased it, but I will put it back up there. He goes through, and this is another one of the things that I feel that shows that this was a continuous teaching. Let's go to, boy, I wished I hadn't erased all that. Okay, so we're going to do Matthew 7. And what we're going to do, we're going to jump to this story about the rock, building your house upon the rock. And Luke 6:47 through 49. This is one of the areas where Luke's and Matthew's stories line up. I mean, there was quite a few other areas. They were both in agreement on the tree that produces good fruit. A bad tree will not produce good fruit. But I wanted to look at this one on building on the rock. So in Matthew, the building of the rock, or building on the rock, is Matthew 7:24 through 27, and the same story, to some degree, is Luke 6:47 through 49. Now, what I want to do, I want to read these two passages, and I want you to see the difference in them. So I'm going to start with Luke 7:24. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts upon them may be compared to a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, the winds blew, and burst against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded upon the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rains descended, and the floods came, the winds blew, and burst against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall." So let's go back. Okay, so real quick on that. Hear what he's saying? He's saying the wise man builds his house upon the rock. And everyone that hears these words of mine and acts upon them. So what we had up there before, we had him talking about the Beatitudes. He's talking about the ethical admonition to us, and then he's talking about the contrast of his teaching with that of the Pharisees, and then back to the ethical admonitions again, and then he takes all that and puts that all together, and he says, okay, if you hear those words that I spoke and you act upon those, he's taken everything that he said and he's bunching it up into this parable about the building on the rock. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts upon them may be compared to the wise man who built his house on the rock. So he's presenting everything he said before, putting it in this parable and say, everything I said before, now let me compare you to a wise man or a foolish man. The wise man will take everything I said and his house, not literally his house, but his life will be built upon what I said. The life that he has, the Christ, the life that's in him, his ethical way that he conducts himself, and that he recognizes that God's law has mercy and grace attached to it, and that we're to show compassion to all people, even our enemies. So he's saying the man who hears these words of mine and acts upon them will be like the wise man. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them will be a foolish man. So that he's talking about everything he's spoken of from the beginning of chapter 5 through the end to this parable. So what I'd like to do is read the same account in Luke, because here the difference, the difference is It's not a big difference, but there is a part of it that to me gives a little more insight. And we want verse 47. Okay, so here in verse 47, Luke, he picks up the basic same theme that Matthew had. Luke 6:47. And why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts upon them, I will show whom he is like. So he's going back with this wise and foolish again. It's the same thing that Matthew was saying. But I want you to see the difference that he presents. He would be who he'll be like, verse 48. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation upon the rock. And when a flood arose, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who has heard and has not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house upon the ground without any foundation, and the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the ruin of the house was great. Notice the difference? Matthew says one man built his house on the rock, the other man built his house on the sand. Wise man on the rock, foolish man on the sand. Luke says he's like a man, the wise man is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation upon the rock. So I've heard this explained this way, not to point the differences in the two gospel readings, but he's not saying you just find a rock and you build your house on it. You dig a foundation. You dig down to bedrock or firm foundation. If you've ever seen any of the high-rises built, some of them, they go down almost as far as they go up to get solid ground, foundation, stones, pillars. And he's saying the wise man, he will dig that foundation. I mean, work involved, the ethical admonitions, the things that we do with our lives build character within us that make our foundation solid. We're operating within God's guidelines, and he said you need a firm foundation, and to have that firm foundation, we need to dig down. We need to work on our ethics about things, and that's what he's talking about here. And this parable, I jotted down here, this parable is not just an add-on. Its purpose is to show the importance of the previous teaching. Earlier, he presented the Beatitudes, the state of the believer in relation to God through Jesus in him. Then he instructs us on our conduct and ethical behavior and concludes with the contrast of the legalistic system and his teaching. And it's not the outward appearance, he said, but it's what is on the inside. So let's look at this again real quick. He says that the man building his house, he dug deep, laid a foundation upon a rock, and when a flood arose, the torrent coming against it didn't damage the house. The other man had just built on the top of the ground, had no foundation. As soon as turmoil and trouble came, it doesn't have to be a flood. It can be anything coming into our lives that creates turmoil. If we don't have the foundation, then we're easily moved. I remember two storms. I remember a storm that hit Charleston, South Carolina. It was Hurricane Hugo. And at the height of the storm, the tidal surge or the wind caught this house, literally moved the house off the foundation and sat it in the middle of the street. And when they went into the house later, the table had been set for dinner. Not one thing had been moved. All the glasses were still sitting in the upright position, napkins, everything was ready for the meal, except the house was not in the right place. It was in the middle of the street. So you can see the the force. I don't know what kind of foundation they had. Maybe it was a house just sitting up on blocks. You know, we have homes here in Florida that just sit up on blocks. They have a crawl space underneath of them. And the second storm I remember was in Ocean City, Maryland. It was the northeaster, and it came, and when it did, it washed the beach away. And I was there the next day, and there were houses that all you could see was just a little bit of the peak. The rest of the house was completely under the sand. There was other houses that were 40 or 50 feet up in the air on stilts because they had laid a foundation down into the rock. The sand moved, but the house was still intact. Now, you know, what you do with your house 40 or 50 feet up in the air, but it shows you that the firmness of the foundation will determine if you survive in storms or not. And for us, the firmness of our foundation, where we place our trust and allegiance, is it in Christ and his life within us and his word written on our heart? Are we following that? Or are we taking the broad way of walking and including philosophies and thoughts of the world? If we do, and we don't have that firm foundation, when a storm comes, we're not going to be ready for it. We're going to get tossed every direction. So we read both accounts. So early he presented the Beatitudes. I don't want to repeat myself here. Similarly, the building of our house or our lives must be on a solid foundation. The Pharisees and the religious leaders were all about outward appearances. In fact, at one point, Jesus compared them to a whitewashed tomb, a whitewashed sepulcher, beautiful outside, but inside dead man's bones. Is our foundation solid enough that maybe we don't look as good here, but when the wind comes, we're ready for it. When the storms come, we're ready for it. And the Pharisees were, and religious leaders were all about outward appearance. The wise man builds on the solid foundation. The solid foundation will not be seen from the outside, but it will show its strength when things get difficult. Luke's description of the story is much more detailed. He points out it is not just the site selection where you put the house, it's about the site preparation. So we can set our house what we would think would be in the right place, our lives. Good neighborhood, good job, good income, all these things. But if we don't have that foundation of Christ for our lives, we look good on the surface, but when the storms come, we're not able to withstand the storms. So the site location is not the critical thing, it's the site preparation. And any architect or builder will tell you that. If you don't have the good foundation, that's what the cornerstone is. You lay that cornerstone, you get it perfect level and the right angles and everything, and then everything else is measured from that. That's how you build that house. Everything is measured from that. If Jesus is our cornerstone, then all of our measurements, all of our actions should be based on that level place where he puts us. And we have to dig down to get a solid foundation. The work is involved to secure our position. And Jesus said in Matthew, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead man's bones and all uncleanliness." That's Matthew 23:27. So I think in applying this teaching to our lives, it requires us to establish that firm, solid foundation, what we believe, what our life represents, and how we approach God and respond to him in things. Then when the turmoils come, we have a solid place to stand. We don't want to have to be doing this against the wind. We want to be solid in our position. Yeah, circumstances and things are going to be difficult. We understand that. Sickness is going to come. Conflict's going to come. All those things, and it's not things that we want, but if we're prepared with the foundation of him as the cornerstone, then we're going to be able to withstand those storms. Okay? Father, we do